In 2010, Treyarch gave us the original Call of Duty Black Ops, and 10 years later in 2020, we got Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, but what exactly changed over those 10 years when it comes to attention to detail? Beginning with an interesting detail at the beginning of each game, both Black Ops and Black Ops Cold War begin the same with a black screen illuminated by the flick of a flame of a lighter, with the smoke illuminating the opening mission of Black Ops during the Bay of Pigs.
Carlos, you know Bowman, right?
While Cold War does this as well, revealing the opening mission in Amsterdam, which is a cool way to show how these games are related. Moving on to a comparison of the level of detail between some of the guns between the two games, beginning with the AK-47, and in the original Black Ops, if you zoom in on the back here, you can actually see a Soviet star on the back of the AK-47, which is kind of cool. But obviously being 10 years newer, Cold War's weapon models are far more detailed and much more impressive looking. And the same goes for the weapon sound effects, as the original Black Ops weapons don't have the same crunchy quality that you have in Cold War when it comes to firing and reloading. Also, take this M16 for example. Whenever I fire it in the original Black Ops, it still looks and sounds great, but whenever I do the same thing in Cold War, there's lots of added detail like the smoke coming out the end of the barrel, which really does look awesome. But I gotta say, for a game that came out in 2010, the real-time reflections on the surface of the 1911 is still pretty impressive. And they do a decent job of reflecting what's actually in the environment, as you can see by these flames. While Cold War takes these reflections even a step further, with the reflections themselves more accurately representing the environment around you. As you can see by this shade of blue on the side of my weapon, whenever I turn around, it's this blue door right behind me. And the reflections of the flames still don't look half bad. Moving on now to a comparison of how each game handled close quarters combat, and in the original Black Ops, when it came to CQC, you basically just had your basic knife melee across both single player and multiplayer, with the exceptions being a few scripted moments in the campaign. One of which, interestingly, you take an enemy as a human shield and continue firing your weapon. Whereas in Cold War, it's completely different, whereas in the campaign, whenever you melee an enemy, you actually go into a first-person takedown animation, which is pretty sweet. Not to mention that scripted moment in the original Black Ops where you took an enemy as a human shield is something you can do to any enemy in the campaign. While in multiplayer, unless you have a knife, you kinda just have to awkwardly beat somebody to death. That is, unless you get behind him and do an extended assassination. Moving on now to a comparison of the bullet decals between the two games, and in the original Black Ops, whenever you say shoot a brick wall, a rifle does leave big dark bullet decals in the wall, and pistols leave smaller bullet decals in the wall, as they should, but the bullet decals themselves are not that detailed. While in Cold War, whenever you do this exact same thing, the bullet decals themselves are a bit more detailed, though there's less of a difference in the decal size whenever you're using different sized weapons. Now, whenever you're shooting enemies, it's a bit different, as in the original Black Ops, whenever you shoot an enemy, it leaves bright red blood decals on the enemy that last quite a while. Whereas in Cold War, the blood decals themselves are a lot more muted and a bit more difficult to see, and they disappear much more quickly. Moving on to some of the details I noticed when it comes to the explosives between these two games, and in the original Black Ops, whenever you throw a frag grenade, the explosion itself still looks pretty good, and the blast mark on the ground lasts quite a while. While in Cold War, whenever you throw a frag grenade, your character actually pulls the pin out with their teeth, which is pretty cool, and the explosion obviously looks pretty great as well, but the blast mark on the ground actually disappears pretty quickly. It was also pretty cool to see the added detail on things like the RCXD, which returns in Cold War but appears much more crisp. But one of my favorite things when it comes to explosives is how in the older Call of Duty games, whenever you fire an RPG, it's kind of a wild card and that thing's going to go wherever it wants to go. Whereas in the newer Call of Duty games, the RPG is pretty pinpoint accurate, and I kind of miss the way it used to be. And speaking of explosions, the original Black Ops would have these really huge, bombastic action movie explosions, especially in the campaign. Whereas in the multiplayer of the original Black Ops, the explosions were toned down significantly for performance reasons. Whereas in Cold War's multiplayer, whenever you call in these napalm strikes, they really do look impressive with lots of really cool fire and smoke effects, and it makes me excited to see what they would look like in Call of Duty Black Ops 6. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the weapon sound effects in the original Black Ops just aren't as high quality as what we hear in Cold War, which is obvious considering the game's 10 years newer, but one cool detail when it comes to the weapon sound design is that in the original Black Ops, whenever you shoot a weapon outside and versus shooting the weapon inside, it sounds exactly the same. Whereas in Cold War, whenever you shoot a weapon outside, it sounds completely different than whenever you're shooting a weapon inside, as the confined spaces actually make the weapon's echoes much more noticeable. Another interesting detail is that you actually visit some of the same locations across campaign and multiplayer between the two games. Like in the original Black Ops, whenever you go to the Yamantau Mountain compound, it's pretty cool to go back and revisit this location with 10 years worth of graphical improvements. And as I mentioned, this applies to some of the multiplayer maps as well, and it's pretty cool to see how much these maps change graphically over 10 years. Another interesting detail I noticed is when it comes to interacting with foliage, in the original Black Ops, whenever you move through bushes, the bushes don't react to you moving through them at all. Whereas in Cold War, whenever you walk through certain bushes, you can actually see the branches and leaves bending to get out of the way of your character. I also tested setting off explosions next to trees to see if the trees would react. In the original Black Ops, they don't react at all, but interestingly, in Black Ops Cold War, they don't react either, which I thought was kind of surprising. Now let's show a comparison of what it's like shooting different parts of cars between the two games. And in the original Black Ops, whenever you shoot a tire, you can actually hear the air leave the tire after the first shot, but after that you just see these big bullet decals left on the tire, and the tire itself doesn't really take any damage. Whereas in Black Ops Cold War, whenever you do this exact same thing, after a few shots you actually see the tire deflate and the car will lower, which is a pretty cool detail. I also tested shooting out the glass on these cars, and in the original Black Ops, you do see the bullet decals on the glass, but eventually the entire windshield will become damaged before the entire windshield will eventually shatter, and this also applies to the smaller windows as well. And in Black Ops Cold War, it's pretty similar. They go through different stages of damage, but what's pretty cool is that as you shoot out the windshield, different parts of the windshield actually start to fall off depending on where your bullets are hitting, which is pretty cool. And since we got this far, I wanted to show a comparison of the actual car explosions between the two games, and at the end of the day, they still both look pretty great. Moving on now to one of my favorite differences, which is actually how each game handles advanced movement, because in the original Black Ops, whenever you were sprinting and you held the crouch button, your character would go into an awesome action movie dive. Whereas in Black Ops Cold War, sadly, the dive was removed and instead replaced with the combat slide, which was seen in other newer Call of Duty games. Another interesting bit is that a lot of the characters from the campaign are shared between the original Black Ops and Cold War, with the 2010 character model still looking pretty impressive with the voice talents of Sam Worthington, Ed Harris, and even Ice Cube. And though the Cold War character models are much more impressive, due to the game being 10 years newer, it is a shame that all the voice talent had to be replaced, especially since the voice actors are obviously trying to mimic what came before. But hey, I guess the trade-off when it comes to the characters themselves is that in the original Black Ops, when you look down, you couldn't see your feet, and in Cold War, you definitely can. So, yay. I also like to compare water effects between games, and in the original Black Ops, whenever you shoot the water, there's this big splash effect of the water shooting way up into the air, but there's not much of a ripple effect on the surface of the water itself. Whereas in Black Ops Cold War, the splash effect is toned down a little bit, but the ripple effect is more noticeable. I also wanted to test the water effects when it comes to explosives, and in the original Black Ops, it looks fine. But I gotta say, Cold War does take this a step further, as the explosion looks much more impressive with the water effects, but also the muted sound effect of the explosive going off underwater sounds pretty great. And speaking of water effects, I wanted to test whether or not your weapon would have any kind of shine whenever your character came out of the water between the two games, and as you can see here in the original Black Ops, your gun does not appear to be wet at all. And I also tried this in Cold War, but I couldn't find an area where I could actually go prone in the water. It would only let me crouch, so I couldn't actually get my gun beneath the surface of the water. But I also tested this on a mission where the level was raining, and as you can see, the water is not accumulating on my weapon at all, as it usually does in newer Call of Duty games.
Crowd should be coming through the checkpoint soon.
Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching this direct comparison of the original Call of Duty Black Ops versus Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. And really the reason I wanted to make this video is because consistently Call of Duty Black Ops are my favorite Call of Duty games across campaign, multiplayer, and zombies. So I really wanted to make this video in anticipation of Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and I can't wait to make another direct comparison of that game versus probably Cold War, or I don't even know. But I'm really looking forward to Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it for you guys. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Live from My Basement, where I make cool new videos like the one you're watching right now every single week. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.